The sheriff's trucks were already blocking my driveway when the HOA president pointed at my land and claimed I had stolen her son's property. Not borrowed it. Not disputed it. Stolen it. A century-old lake ranch I had legally restored was suddenly treated like evidence at a crime scene. Permits didn't matter. Deeds didn't matter. Her authority did. That accusation triggered fines, inspections, and a legal process that couldn't be undone. I didn't know then, but that decision cost them everything. Because while they were trying to erase my ownership, they overlooked one document that changed the power balance forever. And the moment it surfaced, there was no way for anyone to walk it back. Before we jump into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you've ever had a crazy HOA moment, hit subscribe so you don't miss how this ends. The accusation didn't fade after the sheriff left. It lingered. Notices started appearing where friendly waves used to be. My name stopped being spoken directly and started being referenced in emails I wasn't copied on. That was when I realized this wasn't about a misunderstanding anymore. It was about control. I'd bought the lake ranch quietly. No announcement. No grand plans beyond restoring what time had worn down. The property had been there for over 100 years, passed through families, slowly forgotten as newer developments wrapped around it. I wasn't trying to change the neighborhood. I was trying to preserve something that already existed. Most days, that meant early mornings, paperwork, contractors coming and going, and the slow satisfaction of fixing what had been neglected. Normal life came in short moments. Coffee by the water, checking fences, listening to the wind off the lake. Nothing dramatic. Nothing loud. The HOA president noticed me almost immediately. At first, it was subtle. A lingering stare during inspections. Questions that weren't really questions. Comments about community standards that didn't seem to apply to anyone else. She talked about her role like it was a position of authority rather than a volunteer board seat. I didn't think much of it then. At the time, it seemed minor. People like rules. People like order. That's what I told myself. What I didn't realize was how closely she was watching the land itself. The ranch bordered a parcel her family had once claimed interest in decades earlier. Not ownership, interest. Old assumptions, not documents. Her adult son had grown up hearing stories about what should have been theirs. I didn't know any of that when I moved in. I didn't know that, to her, my presence wasn't neutral. It was an intrusion. The first notice arrived less than a month after the restoration work began. A courtesy warning. No fine. Just a statement that certain improvements hadn't been approved by the HOA. It didn't specify which improvements. Just a reminder that all changes must comply with community guidelines. I remember holding that paper and thinking it was oddly vague. I also remember setting it aside, assuming clarification would come later. It didn't. Instead, inspectors started showing up unannounced. Measuring distances. Taking photos. Asking questions they already seemed to have answers for. Every interaction was polite on the surface, but tight underneath. Like a script they'd rehearsed. I kept cooperating. I kept providing documents. Permits. Surveys. Everything checked out. Every time. That should have ended it, but it didn't. A second notice followed. This one wasn't a courtesy. It referenced potential encroachment. That word stuck with me. Encroachment implies intent. It implies theft. Still, there was no explanation. Just a deadline to respond and a warning about escalating enforcement. At the time, it felt like bureaucracy. An annoyance. I didn't realize what that notice really meant. Around the lake, neighbors started keeping their distance. Conversations ended when I walked up. Work trucks were suddenly reported for blocking access, even when they weren't. Someone filed a complaint about noise during hours the county explicitly allowed. Each issue alone was small. Together, they formed a pattern. The HOA president began speaking for the board without votes. Issuing statements before meetings. Referencing legal counsel without naming anyone. When I asked for specifics, I got summaries instead of answers. Policies instead of explanations. Rules instead of reason. Then came the letter that changed the tone completely. It stated that the HOA was opening a formal review into my ownership of the lake-adjacent land. Not usage, ownership. It claimed there were historical discrepancies that justified intervention. It warned that failure to comply could result in fines, liens, or further legal remedies. No signatures from other board members. Just hers. I remember rereading that sentence about ownership several times, trying to understand how a homeowners association thought it could question recorded deeds, trying to figure out what authority they believed they had. I didn't feel angry. I felt watched, pressured, like the ground under me was shifting quietly. I responded with documentation. Calmly, professionally. I assumed logic would correct whatever this was. Instead, the HOA escalated. The next notice wasn't a warning. It was an enforcement action. And it made one thing very clear: they weren't asking anymore. The enforcement notice triggered a chain reaction I couldn't slow down, no matter how carefully I responded. Within days, fines began appearing on my account for violations that weren't listed anywhere in the bylaws they sent me. Unauthorized land alteration. Unapproved structural impact. Broad phrases. Flexible phrases. The kind that could mean anything if someone wanted them to. I filed a formal appeal. That was my first mistake. The appeal didn't pause enforcement. It invited scrutiny. Inspectors returned with new measuring tools. This time, they flagged areas they had already approved weeks earlier. Fence lines suddenly shifted on their maps. A foot here, 2 feet there. I watched boundaries move on paper while the land itself stayed exactly the same. When I questioned the discrepancies, I was told the HOA was reassessing historical data. At the time, I thought this was the worst, but it wasn't. The fines escalated faster than I expected. Daily penalties, administrative fees, review charges. Each letter arrived with a different total, as if the numbers were being adjusted in real time. I paid some of them just to keep things from getting worse. That only made it worse. Payment, I learned, was treated as acknowledgement. That realization changed how every envelope felt in my hands. Contractors started backing out. Not because of me, because of the HOA. They were told permits might be revoked. That work performed on disputed land could expose them to liability. I began losing progress and money at the same time. Restoration slowed. Deadlines slipped. And every delay was cited as another violation. Then the neighbors got involved. Complaints appeared that I couldn't trace. Reports of blocked access roads I wasn't using. Claims that my equipment was damaging shared land it had never touched. Each complaint triggered another inspection. Each inspection created another report. I stopped seeing them as separate issues. They were feeding each other. One afternoon, I received a notice that stopped me cold. The HOA had requested an emergency review with the county, claiming there was an unresolved property dispute that could impact community safety. Safety. That word opened doors I didn't know they could reach. It pulled outside authorities into something that had started as an HOA issue. I didn't know then how far that label could travel. I submitted my deed again, this time with certified copies, surveys, and historical records attached. I expected that volume of evidence to slow things down. Instead, it triggered a new accusation. The HOA president claimed the documents conflicted with community-held records. Records no one could produce. Records no one had seen. That was the moment I realized facts weren't the currency here. Pressure was. The next escalation came quietly. No letter. No warning. Just a lien notice filed against my property for unpaid fines I was actively disputing. I found out by accident while checking on unrelated paperwork. Seeing that filing felt like the ground drop out beneath me. Liens don't argue. They sit there. They wait. I contacted the HOA for clarification. What I got back was procedural language and deadlines. No acknowledgement of the dispute. No pause. Just instructions on how to pay or escalate legally. Either path cost time and money. Both kept the pressure on. I thought that filing a formal complaint with the board would force transparency. Instead, it isolated me. Meetings were rescheduled without notice. Agendas were altered after posting. Decisions were recorded as unanimous even when I knew votes hadn't happened. The HOA president spoke for everyone. No one corrected her. That should have raised alarms sooner. Then came the boundary notice. The HOA claimed a new survey showed I was occupying land that didn't belong to me. The surveyor's name was listed. When I contacted them directly, they denied conducting any recent work on my property. That discrepancy sat there, unresolved, like a crack no one wanted to look at too closely. I thought exposing that would stop things, but it didn't. Instead, enforcement accelerated. The HOA issued a cease and desist order on all restoration work, citing the disputed boundary. That froze everything. Materials sat unused. Deadlines passed. And each missed deadline triggered another fine. I was being penalized for complying with their own order. That loop was intentional. I could feel it. I pushed back harder. I requested mediation. I requested an independent review. I requested access to the records they kept referencing. What I received instead was a legal notice. The HOA was considering further remedies if compliance wasn't achieved within a fixed window. That letter changed everything, because attached to it was a claim I hadn't seen before. One sentence, almost buried. The HOA asserted that my ownership might be invalid due to historic transfer irregularities. Not usage. Not boundaries. Ownership itself. They were laying groundwork for something bigger. I didn't sleep much after that. The pressure seeped into everything. Phone calls that cut off abruptly. Emails that went unanswered for days, then returned with new demands. Neighbors who avoided eye contact. Others who suddenly felt comfortable standing too close to the fence line. Watching. Measuring with their eyes. I started documenting everything. Photos. Dates. Copies. It felt reactive, but it was the only control I had left. Then the HOA made a move I didn't see coming. They filed a formal complaint alleging I had knowingly misrepresented ownership during restoration permitting. That accusation carried consequences beyond the HOA. It suggested fraud. It invited scrutiny from agencies that don't deal in neighborhood politics. When I read that filing, I understood the strategy. If they couldn't force me out through fines, they'd question my right to be there at all. At the time, it felt unreal, like watching someone else's life unravel from a distance. I prepared to respond. I gathered documents I hadn't needed in years. I contacted professionals I hoped I wouldn't need. I assumed I still had time to correct the narrative. I didn't. Before I could submit my response, the HOA escalated again. This time, it wasn't a letter. It was an action that couldn't be undone. And when I saw what they'd done, I realized this wasn't just spiraling. They had crossed a line that forced everything into motion, whether they were ready for it or not. The escalation stopped feeling abstract the day the courthouse envelope arrived. Not certified. Not dramatic. Just official. The HOA had taken the dispute beyond fines and enforcement and into a formal challenge of my ownership. They weren't asking for compliance anymore. They were asking the court to decide whether the land I lived on was ever mine to begin with. That was the moment everything narrowed. I didn't panic. I didn't argue. I did the one thing the HOA hadn't expected me to do so early. I responded fully. Not with another appeal. Not with explanations. With evidence. Deeds, transfers, tax records, surveys going back generations. Documents that didn't rely on HOA interpretations or community records. Documents that existed long before the HOA did. What I didn't realize then was that the HOA had already made a move they couldn't reverse. Their filing didn't just accuse me of invalid ownership. It asserted that the land had been misappropriated decades earlier and that the HOA had a duty to reclaim it. That language mattered, because it didn't just challenge me, it exposed them. It invited scrutiny into how an HOA believed it could assert rights over privately recorded land. And once that door opened, it didn't stay under their control. The hearing wasn't theatrical. No raised voices. No dramatics. Just pressure. The kind that builds when claims are forced to stand next to proof. The HOA arrived confident. They always had. Their filings were aggressive. Their postures suggested authority. They acted like this was procedural. Routine. Then the documents were entered. The first shift was subtle. The court didn't react emotionally, it recalibrated. Dates were compared. Transfers aligned. Boundaries locked into place. Every record the HOA referenced traced back to assumptions, not filings. Internal summaries. HOA maintained maps. None of it matched the county archive. That should have been enough. But the real turning point came from something the HOA had filed themselves. Buried in their earlier enforcement paperwork was a statement asserting continuous HOA oversight of the land for community governance purposes going back nearly 40 years. They'd included it to strengthen their authority claim. Instead, it contradicted their own argument. You can't oversee land you don't acknowledge as privately owned, and you can't reclaim land you've been regulating as someone else's. That contradiction didn't need explanation. It sat there, undeniable. I didn't realize what that single sentence would set in motion. The court paused. Requests were made. Clarifications demanded. The HOA president's certainty fractured under scrutiny. Not publicly, structurally. Their position wasn't wrong because of emotion. It was wrong because it didn't align with reality. Then came the moment that changed the entire case. The HOA had submitted a survey as part of their claim, the same one they'd used to justify enforcement and cease and desist orders. Under review, it became clear the survey wasn't just inaccurate. It wasn't valid. The listed surveyor had never certified it. The file number referenced a different property entirely. That wasn't a mistake. That was misrepresentation. The room didn't react loudly, but the energy shifted instantly. Because invalid surveys don't just weaken cases, they raise questions about intent, about process, about how many decisions had been based on something that never should have existed. The HOA tried to reposition, to frame it as an administrative error. But by then, the pattern was visible. Fines issued based on false boundaries. Enforcement actions tied to unverifiable records. A lien filed without legal grounding. Each move that once felt like pressure now looked like overreach. The decisive moment came when the court addressed the lien. The HOA had placed it while ownership was under dispute, using penalties that were still under appeal. That action wasn't just aggressive, it violated procedure. And once that violation was acknowledged, everything connected to it became unstable. I felt the shift before it was stated outright. The weight moved off me. What followed wasn't triumph. It was unraveling. The court didn't rule emotionally. It dismantled the HOA's position piece by piece. Authority questioned. Standing challenged. Claims narrowed until there was nothing left to support them. And through it all, one fact remained unchanged. My ownership had never been broken. But the HOA's authority had. Their final argument tried to salvage control, to assert that even if ownership stood, enforcement actions were still justified under community governance. That was the peak of their overreach. And it collapsed under its own logic. Governance doesn't override recorded property rights. It never had. By the time the hearing concluded, the case wasn't about a land dispute anymore. It was about abuse of power. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Because while the ownership challenge was collapsing, the consequences of the HOA's actions were spreading. Their filings had been copied. Their accusations recorded. Agencies that had been pulled in under claims of safety and fraud were now reviewing the source of those claims. The HOA president didn't lose composure. But the confidence was gone. What replaced it was something far more dangerous: silence. No follow-ups. No statements. No attempts to clarify. And that silence said everything. As the court adjourned, I understood that the legal question had been answered, but the fallout was just beginning. Because the HOA hadn't just challenged my ownership. They'd documented their own misconduct in the process. I didn't know then how many doors that would open, or how many people would start asking questions they couldn't control. I only knew that the balance of power had shifted permanently. And once it did, there was no way for the HOA to pretend this had been a misunderstanding. They had forced it into the open. What came next would determine whether they survived it at all. The ruling didn't end things cleanly. It ended them slowly, the way pressure releases after something has already cracked. Within days of the court's decision, the lien against my property was formally removed. Not quietly, officially, recorded, permanent. That single action unraveled months of pressure in one stroke. Every fine tied to the disputed enforcement was voided. Every notice that referenced the invalid survey was withdrawn. The HOA didn't announce it. They simply stopped sending letters. That silence felt heavier than the threats ever had. The restoration work resumed, but the atmosphere around it had changed. Contractors returned cautiously, double-checking everything, as if expecting another interruption. Neighbors watched again, but this time without confidence. The same people who once reported minor issues now avoided eye contact. Power shifts do that. They make everyone reevaluate where they stand. It took weeks for the full scope of the consequences to surface. The county reviewed the HOA's filings related to community safety. Those claims, once stripped of their legal framing, were revealed for what they were: exaggerations built to justify control. Agencies don't like being used as leverage. The HOA was formally warned about future misrepresentation. That warning didn't make headlines, but it changed behavior overnight. Internally, the HOA fractured. Board meetings became tense. Attendance dropped. Members who had stayed quiet during enforcement suddenly asked questions. Votes were delayed. Motions failed. The authority that had once been exercised so freely now required explanation. And explanation is the enemy of unchecked power. The HOA president remained in position, technically, but the role had changed. Decisions that once moved unchallenged now stalled. Emails were carefully worded. References to legal counsel stopped entirely. Control didn't disappear, it weakened. And once weakened, it never fully returned. For me, the resolution wasn't about celebration. It was about reclaiming normalcy. I went back to mornings by the lake. Back to working without watching the driveway for inspectors. Back to progress measured in restored beams and repaired stone, not legal deadlines. The land didn't feel different, but I did. Because living under constant pressure teaches you how fragile stability can be when authority is abused. Financially, the damage took longer to settle. Legal costs accumulated. Delays cost money that couldn't be recovered. Some losses were permanent. But the court's findings mattered. They established a record. A clear line between governance and ownership. That record protected not just me, but anyone else who might face similar pressure in the future. That part mattered more than reimbursement ever could. The community adjusted in small ways. Conversations resumed, cautiously. A few neighbors apologized without saying the word. Others said nothing at all. Trust doesn't snap back into place. Rebuilds slowly, if at all. But the fear that had been quietly spreading, the idea that an HOA could challenge ownership itself, faded. And that absence was noticeable. The Lake Ranch restoration eventually reached a point where I could step back and see it clearly. Not just the structure, but what it represented. A place that had survived a century of changes, nearly undone by paperwork and ego. The irony wasn't lost on me. Something built to preserve community had almost destroyed something far older. What seemed like the end was really just the beginning of understanding how power works in small spaces. HOAs exist in that narrow gap between order and overreach. When they function properly, they fade into the background. When they don't, they dominate everything. This dispute exposed how quickly rules become weapons when no one asks who they're really protecting. The most lasting impact wasn't legal. It was psychological. Once you see how authority can be stretched, you don't unsee it. I became more deliberate, more documented, more aware of how silence enables escalation. That awareness followed me beyond the ranch, into every interaction where procedure was used to avoid accountability. It took months for everything to settle, but the lesson was clear. The HOA never admitted fault. They didn't apologize. They didn't acknowledge the harm. Institutions rarely do. Instead, they adjusted. Quietly. Carefully. And that adjustment was the closest thing to accountability they would ever offer. The land remained mine. Undisputed. Recorded. Secure. But the experience stayed with me. I sometimes think about how easily this could have gone the other way. How many people might not have had the documents, the resources, or the endurance to push back. How many disputes end not because they're resolved, but because someone gives up? That's the part that lingers. Because if this could happen over a restored lake ranch with clear ownership, what happens when the lines aren't so clear? When the pressure is quieter? When the authority is less visible? Power doesn't announce itself when it crosses a line. It normalizes the crossing until resistance feels unreasonable. That's what this was really about. Not land. Not rules. Not even the HO. It was about what happens when someone decides their authority matters more than the truth, and how far that decision can spread before it's stopped. So I'll leave it here, where the dust finally settled. The ranch stands. The lake is calm again. The HOA still exists, but smaller somehow. More cautious. More visible. And the question I keep coming back to is simple. If a homeowners association could push this far in plain sight, in a community full of people watching, what else goes unnoticed until someone refuses to step aside?